So this evening, we're going to be talking about the Ketuvim, the writings. This is what it would look like in Hebrew, Ketuvim, and then, of course, the Greek is Hagiografia, which means the sacred writings. This is the third division of the Old Testament, after the Torah, the Pentateuch, and the prophets. And we know that Christ actually understood the Old Testament to be divided into these three sections, because in Luke, he says, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses," that's the Pentateuch, in the prophets, that's the prophets, and in the Psalms. And here the Psalms are standing in for the entirety of the rest of these writings. Unfortunately, we only have an hour to discuss this section because there are a wide variety of books that are in the writings with all sorts of different genres and all sorts of different themes and so forth. So, for example, there are the poetic books that include the Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. The Megillot, which are the festal scrolls, which include the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And then there are historical books, which include Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So all sorts of different books are in this section. Because the Orthodox never do anything a little bit, we also always do everything a lot. We have a whole bunch of books that are not in the Masoretic text, right? They're in the Septuagint. So to those we would add the book of Sirach, Wisdom, Maccabees, Tobit, Judith, and Esdras. So we have a number of other ones as well. The existence of the Ketuvim as a whole is attested from at least the 4th century BC, when Ben Sirach's grandson noted in the prologue to Ecclesiasticus that his distinguished grandfather devoted himself especially to the reading of the law and the prophets and the other books of our ancestors. So that would be the Ketuvim, the writings. What I was hoping to do with you tonight is to do a brief overview of each of the books in the Ketuvim, and then do a little bit of a deeper dive into a couple of the particularly important ones. I've chosen Daniel and Job and Psalms for us to look at a little bit more closely. I've decided to structure it a little bit differently for convenience sake. So we're going to look at books that are sort of historically themed, then we're going to look at books that are what would be called wisdom literature, and then books that we could call poetic literature as well. The historical books that I want to look at you at, and these are all on your handout as well, be Ruth, Chronicles, Judith, Daniel, Tobit, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Maccabees. And this covers a rather mind-boggling amount of time, all the way from the time of the Judges in about 1300 BC down to about 120 BC or so. So what a good chunk over 1,000 years. And what we need to know a little bit is what is going on historically to get us the context of what's happening in these books. So let's talk a little bit what's happening in a more global way. So this is a map of the Near East in 1300 BC. In 1300 BC, we would be at the time of the Judges. That's the time of Ruth. The story of Ruth is that a woman leaves Bethlehem, leaves Israel, and goes to the land of Moab. So she's leaving this area here and going across into Moab, where unfortunately then her husband and her sons all die, and she decides that she's going to return home. And with her goes her daughter-in-law named Ruth. And Ruth then ends up marrying a man named Boaz and becomes the great-grandmother of David the king. But this is the political landscape of this time period. You'll notice the major power is Egypt, as well as the kingdom of Mitanni, the Hittite kingdom, and then there are a couple of smaller kingdoms over here in southern Mesopotamia, like Babylon, for example. And so at this point, we don't have really an independent kingdom of Israel yet. Israel is still under the hegemony of the Egyptians. This changes, and eventually we'll see in Chronicles and in some of the other books like Kingdoms, the time of King David. And under King David, you get a very strong kingdom that is able to project its force pretty well. Some of the modern scholars have kind of tried to downplay the power that would have been wielded by David, saying that he should have probably been able to have no more than about 5,000 men in his army, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the ancient Egyptians, the superpower of the time, were only able to muster about 20,000 men if they got their whole army together. So actually 5,000 men is a pretty powerful force to be reckoned with for a regional power. Following up on David, who's the next king? Sorry? Solomon. And he creates an empire that is well known throughout the area, right? He marries the daughter of the Pharaoh, for example. So he builds on his father's deeds. And then, of course, right after Solomon, what happens? The kingdom is divided. And in the north you have Israel, and in the south you have the kingdom of Judah. And this is what is going to be going on in the second book of Chronicles. This doesn't last very long, and the kingdom of Israel is invaded and conquered by the Assyrian Empire by 720 BC. The Assyrian Empire is all of this rather garish green here. One of the largest empires of the time. They were well known for their cruelty, and one of the things they would do is they would not only defeat someone, they would destroy their cities completely and deport their populations to somewhere else in the empire. Any ideas why that might be? Why they would do that? Just to be particularly mean here.
To break their spirit.
Break their spirit, what else?
So that they, like, they're in a totally different area.
Yeah.
So, like, they can't, like, gather as much.
Right, if they might be able to put up some resistance if they're in their homeland, but if they're scattered throughout the empire, then there's no chance for them to rebel. And so the population in Israel is replaced by other peoples from the Assyrian Empire. The capital of the Assyrian Empire is a city called Nineveh. So if you're ever on a quest with the other members of Monty Python, you will now know that. And the Assyrians were well known for their cruelty. They wouldn't just, like I said, they wouldn't just conquer a city, they would destroy it completely. They would kill all of the inhabitants of a new city, and then when they went on to the next city in that area, they would say, do you remember what happened to them? And then, of course, you would surrender because you don't want all your people to be put to death. This isn't a very nice way to do business. And so, in 612 BC, the city of Nineveh is conquered by a conglomeration of peoples led by the Neo-Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Cyaxares. And the last king of Assyria, Ashur-uballit II, dies in 609 BC. And then all of the land of the Assyrians is divided between the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Median Empire. And this Neo-Babylonian Empire has quite a bit then to do with the kingdom of Judah. The book of Judith, which was probably, well, we don't know who wrote it, unfortunately. It deals with a heroine named Judith, who thwarts an invasion of Judah by the Neo-Babylonian Empire under the king Nebuchadnezzar. She tricks the invading general and ends up beheading him, which puts a damper on his invasion plans. And so that stops that initial invasion of Judah. However, there is a subsequent invasion, and the city of Jerusalem is conquered by the Babylonians in 587 BC. And just like the Assyrians, the Babylonians deport everyone from Judah that they can get their hands on to Babylon. So that's what's known as the deportation to Babylon. And if you have read Lamentations, which is one of the poetic books, that is a beautiful poem dedicated to the fall of Jerusalem and the horrible things that happen. And it becomes very customary for people to write laments for the fall of a city. So for example, there's one for the fall of Constantinople, there's one for the fall of Thessaloniki, and so forth. There are these laments that are written. A number of the historical books then that are subsequent to this deal with being in exile. So for example, the book of Tobit is one that is about a family that is in exile. A man named Tobit sends his son Tobias to find and rescue his bride. So it's a love story. But he is living in Babylon. And this becomes seen as a type of Christ, right? The father who sends his son to go and rescue someone. He's aided on his journey by the angel Raphael, which is why we know that the angel Raphael exists. And also the book of Daniel was written during the exile to Babylon, which chronicles the life of Daniel. We'll get into that in just a little bit. Babylon was subsequently conquered by another empire. You'll see that there's a theme here. Every empire is going to get conquered by another one. They are conquered by the Persians under an emperor named Cyrus the Great. If you have studied your history, you'll know that you only get the title great if you really, really kill a lot of people. If you stay home and reform taxes, then no one cares about you. But if you really pile up the bodies, then you get the title the Great. So Cyrus the Great conquers all of this, and then his successors, Cambyses II conquers Egypt, and then Darius I conquers Cyrene, and then these sort of peripheral areas here. Cyrus the Great was a very, very clever statesman. One of the reasons that he was able to conquer this much territory was because he would co-opt local people's religions. So, for example, when he invaded Babylon, he told the people of Babylon that he was chosen by Marduk to restore the glory of the Babylonian Empire. And so they accepted him as chosen by one of their gods, which was very clever of him. Cyrus the Great also allowed the exiles to return to their original homelands. So this is the time period of, for example, Ezra and Nehemiah, which chronicles the return of the Jewish exiles from Persia to Israel and the rebuilding of the temple and all that stuff. This is also the time period of a wonderful book called Esther, which was written by a man named Mordecai, who was her uncle. And this book concerns the fate of the Jews that decided not to go back to Israel, but in fact to stay in Persia. So Esther ends up marrying the Emperor Artaxerxes, or as we know him better, Xerxes. And because she marries him, she is able to keep her people safe from a plot from one of his henchmen named Haman, who wants to destroy the Jews. But she's able to turn that on him and kill him instead, which was beautifully adapted for television by VeggieTales as well. So, of course, once again, an empire is followed up by another empire, and the Persian Empire is quickly, or not quickly, but is conquered and defeated by a man named Alexander the Great. Again, lots of dead people involved, and so you get the name the Great. Alexander the Great defeats the Persians at the Battle of Issus, and so takes the entirety of the Persian Empire for himself. Unfortunately, he never actually put a lot of thought into how he was going to structure his empire, and when he died around the age of 25 or so, he his only thoughts to his succession was, "To the strongest," was what he said to his generals. And you can imagine what his generals did with that instruction, and there was war for the next 500 or 600 years as each of them tried, and their successors tried to show that they were the strongest and should take over. But at this point, you have a division. You have the Seleucidian Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire that are the two most powerful. The Seleucidian Empire invades and conquers Israel and Judah, but they are resisted by a group, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans is their family name, and you can read about them in the book The Maccabees, which chronicles their conflict with the Syrians, with the Seleucidians. Although Maccabees 3 has nothing to do with the Maccabees themselves, it's actually about a Ptolemaic attempt to desecrate the temple. So you have the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucidians both trying to exert influence over this area. Before we continue on, I brought a few artifacts that I want to share with you, particularly this one here. This is from the time period. This is from Phoenicia, which is neighboring to Israel. This is a bead, a glass bead in the shape of a person's head. So I'll pass that around so you can take a little look at it and see how, when we're talking about these empires in antiquity, sometimes we can think of them as perhaps not as sophisticated as we are. But this is a work of incredible art, and the same is true for the books of the Bible. They're works of incredible literature as well. So let's talk a little bit about the book of Daniel. Can someone give me a little bit of a summary? Does anyone remember what happens in the book of Daniel? Where was he thrown? Yeah, go ahead.
So he gets captured and taken to, I can't remember where, but...
Yeah, he's one of the exiles to Babylon,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what happens to him there?
He's so intelligent, he becomes part of, like, council or whatever to the king.
He becomes a counselor to the king. Does anyone remember why he becomes a counselor to the king? He interprets dreams. So, in many ways, the story of Daniel is parallel to the story of Joseph. Right? You have a man who is in a foreign land, who rises high in the service of his master, in this case of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Just like Joseph rises high in the service of Potiphar. And then something terrible happens. And what was the terrible thing that happened to Daniel? Lion's den. He gets thrown in a lion's den. But does he eaten by the lions? No, which is lucky for him, right? So he's not eaten by the lions, and then the people who accused him are then themselves fed to the lions, who, since they had been sparing Joseph at this point, were rather peckish and ate them instead. And so he becomes one of the rulers of Babylon. This is the dream that Daniel interprets for the king. And in some ways, perhaps it's even more impressive than when Joseph interprets the dream for the Pharaoh, because Nebuchadnezzar couldn't remember what his dream was. And so he had commanded all of the wise men in Babylon to come to him and to tell him what his dream meant. And his wise men said, "O king, live forever. What was your dream?" And he said, "I don't know. You tell me. You're the wise men. And if you can't do it, I'm going to put you all to death." And they said, "Well, that's impossible." So then he put them all to death, which seems a little unfair, I would think, but we do. But Daniel has the dream revealed to him by God, and this is it. "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and of his arm of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And what do you suppose this meant? What was Daniel's interpretation of the dream? The statue was the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar and the kingdoms that would follow his, right? Just as Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom followed that of the Assyrians, God shows that other empires are going to come next. The empire of the Persians, the empire of the Greeks, the empire of the Romans, and so on. So each of these different materials is a different empire. So the head was of fine gold, that's Babylon. The breasts and arms of silver, that's the Persians. The belly and thighs of brass, that's the Greeks, and so on and so on. But then what happens to all of these mighty empires? They're broken to pieces. By what? A stone that was cut without hands. So what is this a prophecy of? Of Jesus Christ, right? Someone who was born without seed. A stone that is cut without hands and that smites and destroys these kingdoms. And the stone that smote them becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. So this is a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah and the church, right? Which will fill the whole earth. But there's more in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is great. Nebuchadnezzar decides, or rather is led to decide by his counselors, to build a great image of gold whose height was 80 cubits. How big is a cubit? Now, the cubit is from the elbow to the tip of the finger. And how many is a score? 20. So 60 of those, right? So big, in other words. And he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And if you remember the reading from Holy Saturday morning, there's all sorts of instruments, and they keep repeating the name of the instruments over and over and over again, right? The sound of the trumpet and the harp and the lyre and all that stuff. And everyone was supposed to worship this image. But of course, the Jews who were in Babylon in exile, are they allowed to worship an image of gold? No, right? Who are they supposed to worship? So these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or their Greek names Ananias, Azarias, and Misael, they do not worship the image. And because they don't worship the image, what happens to them? They're thrown in a furnace. And the furnace was made so hot that it actually killed the men who were throwing the pitch and naphtha and whatnot into it. So that's pretty warm. Almost as warm as the altar gets on Sunday. But in the story, right, in the book of Daniel, they don't die. They're not killed by the flames. And what happens, one of the servants says to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God." So this is again a type of Christ. Christ came and he saved the young men in the fire. And in the 8th ode of the Katavasias of the Theotokos, right, the Son talks about Christ coming and rescuing the young men in the furnace. Now in Hebrew, and sometimes it is mistranslated into English as the Son of the Gods, because in Hebrew it is Ben Elohim. And Elohim is actually a plural word, but it can either be the gods when you're talking about like Zeus and those people, or it is used for God, as in the actual God. So this is this Ben Elohim means the Son of God, and all of the Greek translations, the Septuagint, show that. It is Ios Theou, the Son of God in the singular. So he's not talking about the Babylonian gods Marduk and all those guys, and he's talking about God himself. And of course, we read the prayer of Azarias chant the hymn of the Three Youths on Great and Holy Saturday morning, which is one of the highlights of the service, other than the priest throwing the babies around. It's probably my second favorite part. So that's a little bit about the book of Daniel. The second type or genre of literature that we see in the writings is that of wisdom literature. And wisdom literature is incredibly popular in antiquity in the Near East. There's examples from Egypt, there's examples from Mesopotamia, and so forth as well. In fact, they're so popular that we have all sorts of collections of them. Basically what they are, they're sayings and proverbs that are collected and written down by scribes. Scribes being so important that the Egyptians would make little statues of scribes to bring with them into their tombs. This is an Ushakti figurine from the New Kingdom in Egypt, and you can tell from his shaved head that he is a scribe, because the Egyptians wanted to, of course, bring their servants with them into the afterlife, and you're not going to start taking notes yourself after the whole life of having a scribe do it, so you're going to bring a scribe with you. So you can pass that around and take a look at it if you want. It is, it's a wooden statue covered in bronze from the New Kingdom in Egypt. The books of wisdom literature that are included in the Ketuvim are Job, Ecclesiasticus, the Wisdom of Sirach, the Wisdom of Solomon, and Proverbs. We're going to talk a little bit about Job and about Proverbs. But the other ones are also, of course, incredibly important. Ecclesiasticus, for example, is attributed to King Solomon, and it discusses the vanity of life without God. Just a quote from "Vanity of vanities, what advantage does a man have in all his labor in which he toils under the sun?" Right? Without God, right? With God, all things are possible, but without God, nothing is possible, is the message of Ecclesiasticus. In the Wisdom of Sirach, we see wisdom coming from God. And then in the Wisdom of Solomon, we see that that the Sophia, the wisdom that God gives, is Christ. The book of Proverbs is another book of wisdom literature compiled by King Solomon between 970 and 931 BC, or sometimes when someone says that a king did something, many times that means the king said that something was to be done. We have, for example, the hymn of Justinian that he, I'm sure, was involved in writing, but also, I'm sure, had help. And this book is particularly interesting because wisdom becomes personified. Wisdom isn't only this abstraction, but the book says, "From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, before the earth began. When there were no watery depths, I was brought forth, when no springs were overflowing with water." Wisdom is something eternal, something that was brought forth or begotten eternally. And who is begotten eternally? Christ. So the wisdom of God, right? So we see in the Old Testament Christ, right? The second person of the Trinity. And that's why the great church in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, which is sometimes just translated as Saint Sophia, is actually the Holy Wisdom. It's a church dedicated to Christ. One interesting thing is that in both Greek and in Hebrew, the word wisdom is feminine. But particularly in this case, the femininity is because wisdom is being contrasted with foolishness. And so they're both being personified here. The book of Job is a very uncomfortable book to read. It is set in the time of the patriarchs, approximately 1600 BC, so at the time of like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And although it's considered part of the wisdom literature, most of the book is poetic, is written in poetry, and it's some of the most beautiful poetry in Scripture. And you can really tell that the author of the book identified with Job. He really put his heart and soul into the writing of this poetry. It is beautiful to read. And it discusses the problem of why do good people suffer so greatly, which is, of course, that's a difficult issue to discuss. The structure of it begins with a prologue in prose, and it talks about how wealthy Job was. So Job, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and his cattle consisted of 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys. Moreover, he possessed a very large number of house servants. I currently have 10 ducks and 3 children, and that's plenty. So I don't know how someone is able to deal with 7,000 sheep. That seems like a lot of sheep. Why have so many sheep? Why doesn't it say he had a giant pile of gold? Why does it talk about his cattle?
That was the wealth.
That was wealth. Why was that wealth?
Because of the wool, where were the sheep well?
Yeah. Why is that? Why did they consider that to be the wealth? Why not talk about his piles of gold and jewels and so forth?
I don't think merchants.
Okay, merchant. Well, what can he do with sheep?
I mean, yeah, shear, yeah.
You can shear them and then sell the wool. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, little.
They grow the wool back.
Then they grow the wool back, exactly.
And they reproduce.
And they reproduce. Yeah, exactly. So when we think of wealth, we think of money, we think of gold, we think of things like that. But if you have thousands of sheep and thousands of camels and thousands of donkeys, you're not staying in one place very long, right? Because they're going to eat all the grass, and then you have to move somewhere else. So if you're moving every couple of months, are you going to load up all of your gold on carts and bring it with you? I don't have a lot of gold, but it's heavy, right? It's something that's difficult to move. And you're not going to have a giant palace because, well, you have to move every few months. So you can't pack up your palace and move. So you live in tents. You don't have a lot of gold, but your wealth is measured in how much cattle you have. And our language, English, remembers that even if we don't necessarily as a society, because what do we have to pay if you buy an airline ticket, for example, and there's extra fees tacked onto it, right? The word fee is actually a Germanic word related to the German fee, and it means cattle animals. So the fees that you pay are cattle animals. So our language remembers it even if our culture doesn't. And if you are paying something in kind, right? Kind is a word for cow. Right? So cows are a way that you can pay for things. Of course, nowadays, if you bring a chicken to a grocery store, they're not going to be particularly happy about it. But what can you do, right? Then the devil is permitted to test Job by God. Job's testing, his children are all killed. His animals are all killed or stolen. His servants are all killed, and he loses his health. So he goes from having everything, from being one of the most prominent men in his culture, one of the wealthiest, to having nothing. Almost overnight. It's very frenetic in the text. There's one messenger after another. My Lord, I just come from your sheep, and fire fell from heaven and consumed them and your servants, and only I escaped. And then immediately another one comes and said, a bunch of bandits came and killed all your servants, and only I escaped, and they stole all of your camels. And then another one. It's right after another. So this poor man is getting one messenger after another, with nothing but terrible news. But this part of the text ends with the quote, "In all these things that happened to him, Job did not sin with his lips against the Lord." So even in all of these misfortunes and all these terrible things that happen, it didn't cause him to sin against God. The next section switches from prose to poetry. And this section is all speeches. Job has a long lament, and then all of his friends show up and talk about how he must have done something terrible in order to get such misfortunes fall on him. And these are kind of ironically known as his comforters, because they show up and say, well, you must have done something. Can you think of anything you may have done that God may not be happy with? And that's why he killed everyone around you. Then there is a discourse on wisdom, which is why this is part of the wisdom literature. And finally, a man named Elihu has a couple of speeches in which he talks about the goodness of God. Right? You contrast all the horrors that this man has been through, and then you talk about the goodness of God. Finally, God shows up himself and talks to Job out of a whirlwind. And he talks to Job about how the understanding of Job cannot possibly fathom God's purpose. And I know Father has talked about this kind of over and over again in his sermons, about how we don't understand what is going on. We have tunnel vision, right? We can see what's happening right in front of us, but we don't know how this fits into the grander scheme of what's going on. And that is what God says to him. Then God rebukes the friends of Job, the ones who came to him and said, well, you must have done something, you must be guilty of something for this to happen. And he says, no, Job is innocent. Job has done nothing wrong. And finally, God restores Job's wealth and gives him 7 sons and 3 daughters, just as he had before. And St. Gregory says that this is in order that those who had been destroyed might be shown to be alive. And then he doubles all of his other stuff. So where he had 7,000 sheep before, now he has 14,000 sheep, and so on. So Job, in his suffering, is a type of Christ. He's innocent, and he suffers. And in losing everything, he undergoes sort of a metaphorical death, right? He loses everything, he dies. But then everything is restored, right? He goes through that metaphorical resurrection. So he becomes like Christ in that sense. The last section of the writings are the poetic books, the Psalms, the Song of Songs, and the Lamentations. We talked a little bit about Lamentations already, right? It's a poem about the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, and just the lament for the people being led into captivity and the desolation that's left behind. The Song of Songs is sometimes referred to as the Song of Solomon. It's attributed to Solomon the king and written between 965 and 960. This is traditional Middle Eastern love poetry and discusses a husband and wife's love for each other. But by extension, it's interpreted to be God's love for humanity and Christ's love for the church. Now, the last book I wanted to discuss with you briefly is Psalms. The book of Psalms is a collection of hymns. It's written over the course of several hundred years by a number of different authors, including David the King. And how many of them are there? Is it, sorry? It's almost 150. It's very close. It's 151.
It's 150.
There are 151 psalms. But of course, in the Protestant Bibles, there's only 150 of them. The numbering is also slightly off. So our Psalm 50, for example, will be Western Psalm 51, or possibly the other way around. I always get them mixed up. Yeah.
Do you know why that is?
Do I know why that is?
Yes.
I forget which psalm, but one of them is really, really long and was divided in two. Yeah, I think so. Do you remember do you know which one it is, Father?
Very, very early on.
Yeah.
I know 18 is very long, but I'm not sure if that's the one that splits.
Isn't 150 such a nice round number?
It's too nice, right? You can't, it's too close to perfection, so you have to. Okay, Psalm 9. Psalm 9 becomes 9 and 10. Psalms has a wide variety of themes and use. So Psalms talks about the coming of the Messiah. Psalms talks about prayers for the king, lamentations. It talks about the marriages of the kings. There are festal hymns. Every single psalm has sort of a different theme, but the main themes would be the coming of the Messiah, prayers for the king, lamentations, and songs of praise. So in the second handout, we have a couple of psalms that we can look at together. And now it's someone else's turn to read. Who'd like to read a little bit for us? Psalm 84. Anyone care to read for us a bit? Please, Luke, go ahead.
For the end, a psalm for the sons of Korah. O Lord, you are pleased with your land. You returned back the captivity of Jacob. You forgave the transgressions of your people. You covered all their sins. You ended all your wrath. Return from the wrath of your anger. Turn us, O God, of our salvation, and turn away your anger from us. Will you be angry with us forever, or will you prolong your anger from generation to generation? O God, you will turn and give us life, and your people will be glad in you. Show us your mercy, O Lord, and grant us your salvation. I will hear what the Lord God will speak to me, for he will speak peace to his people and to his holy ones. To those who turn their hearts to him, his salvation is very close at hand to those who fear him. That glory may dwell in our land, mercy and truth met together, righteousness and peace kiss each other. Truth arose from the earth, and righteousness looked down from heaven. The Lord will give goodness, and our land shall yield its fruit. Righteousness shall go before him and establish his footsteps to the mountains.
Thank you. So this psalm prefigures the coming of the Messiah, particularly the section, his salvation is very close at hand to those who fear him, that glory may dwell in our land, mercy and truth met together, righteousness and peace kissed each other, truth arose from the earth, and righteousness looked down from heaven. For the Lord will give goodness, and our land shall yield its fruit. Righteousness shall go before him, and establish his footsteps as our pathway. So this is a stark deviation from what comes before, right? Talking about God's wrath, right? And things like that. And then all of a sudden you have this switch when it talks about mercy and truth meet together, righteousness and peace kissed each other. This is because Christ is coming, right? The Messiah will come and he will put things right. And so that's what this psalm is talking about. Since we are, let's go on to the next one since we are running out of time. Psalm 2. Anyone care to read that for us?
Why do the nations rage and people meditate on vain things? The kings of the earth will set themselves and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands and cast away their yokes from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh at them. The Lord shall mock them. Then shall he speak to them in his wrath and trouble them in his anger. But I was established as king by him over his holy hill Zion, declaring the Lord's decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall shepherd them with an iron staff. You shall shatter them like a potter's vessel. And now, O king, understand. Be instructed, all you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with him with trembling. Take hold of his instructions, lest the Lord be angry, and perish from the righteous way, when his fury shall be quickly kindled. Blessed are all who trust in him.
So this is a lamentation of the king. The king here is talking about how all of the other nations around them are coming together to attack them. Right? Why do the nations rage and the people meditate on vain things? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers gather together. So all of the rulers, all the nations that are surrounding Israel and Judah are intent on attacking them. But what does the king say? Against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands and cast away their yokes from us. He who sits in heaven shall laugh at them. The Lord shall mock them. Then shall he speak to them in his wrath and trouble them in his anger. So even though these nations may be strong and powerful, God is more powerful, and he will destroy them in turn. And then, but I was established as king by him over his holy hill of Zion, declaring the Lord's decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall shepherd them with an iron staff, you shall shatter them like a potter's vessel. Did the king in Jerusalem ever command that kind of authority over all of the nations of the earth historically? No. So who is the king talking about here? Who is the king speaking as? Christ. Christ is the one who's speaking now. God says, you are my son, today I have begotten you. This is Christ who is speaking. So again, even in his lamentation, the king is looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, to when all of the nations will be defeated and God's kingdom will begin. The next one is rather lengthy, so let's just look at sections of it. Psalm 21. It starts out with probably a very familiar phrase. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Who says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus Christ. Good, everyone was listening to Father in that sermon as well. Right. Why does Christ say that? A little louder? I'm sorry, just couldn't hear you.
Because that was his father, and he's been forsaken by his father, and he thinks if anybody can save me, it will be.
That's a good idea, yeah, right? I mean, on the cross, you think, if ever you're forsaken by God, that'd be then, right? But Christ knew, right, that he was going to be doing this. So do you think it was because he thought he was forsaken by God? We have to know a little bit about how Jewish rituals work. The rabbi sings the first line of a psalm, and then everyone else joins in. If you've ever been in a Roman Catholic church and hear the priest sing Credo in unum Deo, and then everyone joins in, it sort of works the same way. And so on the cross, Christ is acting as everyone's rabbi, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And everyone should then immediately think about this psalm, Psalm 21, because this psalm is about Christ's crucifixion and his resurrection. So, for example, if you look further down, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So they pierced my hands and my feet. If you are nailed to a cross, right, your hands and your feet are pierced by nails. And what did the Roman soldiers do with Christ's garments? They cast lots for them, right? They gambled to see who would win his clothing. So this psalm exactly prefigures, right, exactly prophesies what will be happening in the crucifixion. And then, again, there is a switch. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. I will declare your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him, and fear him, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him, he heard. My praise shall be of you in the great assembly. I will pay my vows before those who fear him. The poor shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. Let your heart live forever, right? All of a sudden, When it is at the depth of its most despairing, the psalm has a complete shift in tone and becomes triumphant. Right? Because it is through the crucifixion, through this moment of despair, this most horrible torture. And then what happens? Christ resurrects. Christ is victorious. Christ destroys death. It goes from being dejection to being triumphant. And I think we'll stop there. I think it's just about time to head up to Compline. So that was 3 of 150. So there's plenty more to read. Yes, sorry.
151.
151, that's right.
Do you know why the 6 Psalms are read at Orthodox and then Holy? Why those particular Psalms are, do you know why?
Yes, but it is an incredibly complicated answer. If you're interested in that, there's a great book that was written by Father Michel Najim and Father Patrick O'Grady called the scriptural liturgical books, or something like that. I have it in the office with a borrow it. And it talks about the settings of the Psalter, the different kathismata, and then what you're supposed to be chanting and all that stuff. Yeah. So if you'd like to read that, I can link more on that for sure.
Thank you, Nick. I don't know if, Professor Newman. I don't know, I can't remember if you mentioned that the Psalms are known as the prayer book of the church, which I mention that often. And as Nick was saying, sometimes they seem kind of like dark the way they start, but then there's a turnaround, and there's kind of like that theme of resurrection. And a lot of times when people when they run to prayer, it's because something's not going well in their life. So when we read the Psalms as a prayer, because it's not just something you read through, you pray the Psalms, it is kind of a reminder that although things are dark right now, they will turn around and get better because Christ is victorious. And so that's a theme that we should have in our lives as well. And we see that all throughout the Scripture. The Scripture itself, the whole book is that. It's it starts off with things being hard, and then you have the resurrection of Christ. That they get hard in the church, and then Revelation. Light at the end of the tunnel. And as Orthodox Christians, we tend to focus a lot more on the resurrection. So even on Holy Thursday, for those of you, I know there are a number of you who've never been to our Holy Thursday service yet, but at the midway point in the Holy Thursday service, we do a procession with a cross and sing this beautiful hymn of crucifixion. And that's the day of crucifixion, so we're specifically remembering that. But the last line of that hymn is, "Show also unto us thy glorious resurrection." So even in the midst of the crucifixion, we're thinking resurrection as Orthodox. We don't focus on the pain and the suffering like some other people might. So anyway, thank you, and